Washington in the shadow of Mount St. Helens for this special episode dedicated to the 45th anniversary of the mountain's eruption. It's hard to believe that this many years later, there are still new stories to be told, including one man's who was flying rescue missions following the disaster and his never-before-seen photographs. It's our big story tonight.
Got another that opened up on the west side, whole west side.
May 18th, 1980. The deadly eruption of Mount St. Helens, flattening miles of forest and sending ash across the Pacific Northwest. Michael Cairns,
it was very eerie. It was extremely quiet.
Remembers it well.
We knew it was going to blow at some point, and we just didn't expect it to blow the day that it did.
A Vietnam vet turned pilot for the U.S. National Guard, Cairns was at his first training camp in Washington just days before the disaster.
We got up Sunday morning, had some coffee, and went to the briefing room. And at about 8:45, I think the first call came in from National Guard headquarters letting us know the mountain had blown its top and to get everything out of there if we could.
He experienced the eruption from a vantage point few others had. His helicopter flying through the ash-filled sky.
It sounded like bullets hitting your aircraft. So we were looking to the west and we saw maybe the meanest looking dark black cloud I've ever seen. The whole leading edge had lightning across it, just bolt after bolt.
It wasn't long before his team flew straight into the disaster zone.
The first mud flow had already come through, and it was a mess. All the bridges were out. Mud was everywhere.
An avid photographer, Cairns, had his camera on board.
And there were just too many sights that I didn't want to miss.
The plume, the ash, the aftermath. Now, 45 years later.
This is the cover to the book.
And for the first time,
it's called Under the Ash.
He's publishing the dramatic images.
What I saw during the 6 weeks I was flying, search, rescue, and recovery. I have a daughter and a son, Kim and Michael, and they said, "Dad, you're going to die someday. You're getting older. Why don't you do something about your legacy?"
These photographs tell the story of that legacy through the lens of someone on the front lines.
So this is 4 days after the eruption, and that's what it looked like.
His missions quickly turned from search to recovery.
So we knew that we weren't going to find anybody alive, and this was another logger that was found in the middle of the Toutle River on a log in the middle of the mud flow. And he died a couple days later, but it shows you the severity of the burns and the pain that these people had to have been in.
In all, 57 people died. Michael pulled 5 out from under the ash.
The last person I pulled out was on July 10th.
Now, sitting among what was once flattened, Cairns has this message as he flips through the pages of his past.
To understand the story of what Guard pilots are willing to do to risk their own lives going in on search and rescue missions, and really to understand what the devastation truly was that day.
Michael Cairns' book will be released early next month on Amazon. And we do want to warn those of you who are interested in buying it, there are some very graphic images included of things Mike witnessed during his missions. The photos are very raw and may be disturbing to some, but they can certainly help illustrate the deadly violence of May 18th, 1980. Now, for those of you who may not have been in the Northwest back then, you may not be familiar with some of the stories that so-called locals know well. Drew Mickelson continues our coverage tonight with a look at what the eruption taught scientists and how that information is being used today.
The eruption was not a surprise, but despite blast zone predictions, evacuations, and close monitoring, 57 people died the day the landscape up here completely changed.
Spirit Lake was like this idyllic setting, this beautiful blue lake, heavy forest all around it.
In the winter of 1980, developers hoped to build a cross-country ski area at Spirit Lake near the base of Mount St. Helens.
It was a gorgeous place, it really was.
Veteran King 5 meteorologist Rich Marriott worked for the U.S. Forest Service in those days, studying avalanche risks at the potential ski area. But in March, the mountain showed signs of life.
Scientists continue to record constant rumbling. We felt them.
Instead of recreation, Rich and everyone's focus turned to the potential eruption and eventually evacuations.
All day and night, you could feel it. You could feel it.
Rich met the cantankerous Harry Truman, owner of the Mount St. Helens Lodge on Spirit Lake, the man known for refusing to leave the potential blast zone.
It'd be awfully hard. It'd take an act. They got 3 acts of Congress to move me out of there. And Congress moves awful slow, you know.
Now we asked him, what are you going to do if it erupts? And he said, well, I've got a cave over on the other side of the lake, a secret cave, and I've got a speedboat. I'm just going to jump in that and go over there and wait it out till it's done.
10 days later, on the morning of May 18th, 1980, the mountain erupted, triggering the largest landslide in recorded history. Truman and dozens of others died. Rich, who had been sent home to Seattle just over a week before the eruption, returned 4 days later as a spotter in a military helicopter looking for survivors.
We saw human tracks in the ash. We saw abandoned cars. We saw a school bus that was kind of into the trees. I mean, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now. I mean, it was really, really eerie.
It gives me goosebumps to look at this. It really does.
Rich also flew with an NBC News crew that day.
I mean, this really is something otherworldly. It definitely is. I see something. I don't know if people have ever seen anything like this. This is Spirit Lake. What was it like? Beautiful blue lake, very calm. Freeze over in the winter into a beautiful frozen lake, and now that lake is almost near boiling.
The ceiling was finally lifting a little bit, and we flew up and saw Spirit Lake, just covered in all the trees, and then you could actually see it rose up far enough that you could see that there was a crater there now, and that there wasn't anything above that.
We're looking right into the crater now. Yeah, we're looking right into an area that used to be under thousands of feet of rock.
Mount St. Helens was really a game changer for understanding what we could do about volcanic eruptions.
State seismologist Harold Tobin heads up the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington.
So here's the mountain itself, and every one of those triangles is a station where we're recording earthquakes. We are really just situated, including 2 right in the crater, actually.
He says the 1980 eruption inspired the state and federal governments to increase seismic monitoring in Washington and Oregon. At the time of the eruption, a dozen seismometers were spread across the Northwest. But since then, that number has climbed to more than 700, and not just around volcanoes.
Here in and around Seattle, we've got a bunch of stations, half a dozen or so.
With the increased coverage, the state can keep tabs on potential hotspots. Last year, quakes suggested Mount St. Helens may be recharging. And while no eruption is imminent, Tobin is confident whenever it blows again, they'll be prepared.
If the slightest sign of unrest came to Mount St. Helens or Mount Rainier, one of the other Cascade volcanoes, we would see it, we would know about it, we would know things like exactly how deep those earthquakes were and whether they were moving upward or moving downward or whatever.
If you think about it, we just get loaned this land while we're here.
Rich Marriott witnessed the power of Mother Nature. He's glad with all that destruction 45 years ago came some lessons.
We just didn't understand what the mountain was trying to tell us that first time. The next time Mount St. Helens recharges and tries to do this again, we'll have a much better understanding of what we're dealing with, and people will have a good, solid warning.
Now, there are few people who understand the eruption of Mount St. Helens like those who reported on it 45 years ago. At the time, KGW had a dedicated reporter on the mountain. And if you've been watching this story this week, you've seen his face and heard his name, Boyd Levitt. Well, joining us live from Central Oregon tonight is none other than Boyd Levitt himself. Boyd, thanks for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Blair.
Okay, Boyd, so first, tell us about your St. Helens assignment for KGW. What was that like?
Well, it started with the first earthquake. And while many of us have known earthquakes through our lives, and it was only a 4.0 something like that, but it was an earthquake. And so we hopped in the car and drove up from Portland, cameraman and I, in the snow, and interviewed a few people who were up there. There was a snow plow driver with his big blade on the front of his truck, And, you know, what do you ask people who are up there during a single earthquake? Well, he says the blade was bouncing, and so I could see it was an earthquake. And, you know, I mean, what was it like? It was several days of earthquakes, and the geologists started getting interested and concerned. And so it just billowed from there. I could go on, but in brief, we asked a forest ranger, is there anybody who lives up here? And they said, why? There's this guy right down at the bottom of this road in this little cabin, Harry Truman. So I believe we were the first to interview him. We drove right down with a microphone, and you did not even have to ask him a question. You just held it, and he told his story. As we've come to know Harry Truman through the years, he was very articulate.
So what was he like? I mean, we've heard him in snippets of some of the stories we've been showing all week, but you talked with him several times.
Well, again, he had many stories of his own that he told just living up there. He loved it there. He was well rooted at his cabin. He wouldn't leave it, as we know from history now. That lake, he loved it. He had boats on it. Of course, in the year that we were there, 1980, it was, how do we put this, well past its prime as a resort. He was the only guy in there with dozens of cats and his favorite drinks lined up on a shelf in the room. It was his retreat, his home, and he was not going to leave it.
Walk us through some of your most vivid memories from the lead up and the eruption 45 years ago.
Sure. With the lead up, that was an interesting story because the first eruption wasn't the big one. The first eruption popped a hole in the top of the mountain, and you saw black ash in some of your photography, Blair, and it was just a stark sort of pop, and then it would occasionally erupt some ash. And most of us who haven't seen a big eruption in our lifetime, most of us thought we'd seen it all, that was it, that it popped in the top. That's not the image of it there. That's later the big one. But the earlier images, it was just this black hole in the top. Of course, it progressed to the images you're seeing now, to the big eruption on May 18. And I was there and saw these photos with people stuck in the mud out in the middle of the river, seeing the bridges wiped away, with cars toppled over and homes gone. And the ash that came from this thing, of course, the wind was blowing to the east. Those towns to the east of the Cascades are the ones that got the brunt of all this initially, because that's where it went. But those early eruptions, again, before the big one, we thought that was it. And so we went up to the top of the mountain thinking, oh, all is well. We've seen it all. I wanted to snake a microphone down in to record it for the folks back home so that they could see it and hear it also. But the geologist was wary. We were standing right next to that black crater on the top, and he was looking over at the big lava dome that was forming, underneath, but on the side of the mountain, which eventually slid off. And in one of your reports, it was correctly stated that in the last 2,000 years, it's the biggest landslide on the face of the planet. So what did that do? It opened up the inside of the volcano to the outside with several thousand degrees or whatever it was difference in temperature, and it just blew up. Blair, I have to say to your audience that this isn't the only volcano in the Cascades that has behaved this way. Those of us in Central Oregon know Broken Top. It blew to the side just like St. Helens did. And many of the others have done that too. Many of you have been to Crater Lake. It blew straight up, and that was the result. So many of these mountains are not dormant. They've just gone to sleep. And the issue is that most of us have never seen one do this, and that's because their eruptions are not really on the scale of a human lifespan. And so it's easy to forget what they can do. And this one was an incredible tragedy. Let's make sure we don't forget that, with 57 people perishing in it and many families disturbed from it.
Completely. We do want to show another piece of video from May 6th, 1980, just 12 days before the eruption. And I understand that you were on top of the mountain. So tell us, what do you remember about that?
Well, that is indeed us there. The geologist was with me. I'm in that crazy black hat. The wind is blowing like crazy. The helicopter pilot couldn't really stay there because we couldn't interview each other while we were up there. But again, we understand that's the pit of the original hole popped in the top in the upper right, and we thought that was it. But it was not, I will admit, a very safe trip, but we got out of it just fine. The Boy Scouts and other groups, evacuation down at Spirit Lake of their canoes and all of their supplies for summer camps and that sort of thing. We were there for that as well. And what was that? That was maybe 4 days before the big one. So we didn't really know when the big one was going to happen. But the earthquakes kept their pace up. The authorities did a good job of trying to keep people from driving up the roads. But there are so many back roads in those mountains. Loggers know every single one of them. And it's very easy for people to get up in there. And sadly, that's where there was great loss of life.
Well, Boyd Levitt, former KGW reporter assigned to Mount St. Helens. Boyd, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Blair.
Well, be sure to tune in to KGW Plus tonight at 8 for 2 full hours of special coverage on the eruption of Mount St. Helens. That includes more of KGW's archive footage from the lead-up, eruption, and the aftermath. Again, that's tonight at 8 on our streaming app, KGW Plus, which you can download for free on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. But our Mount St. Helens coverage here on The Story is not over yet. After the break, you recognize this guy? We'll bring in Chief Meteorologist Matt Safino to talk about some of the weather data from May 1980. And later, we'll share some of your memories. That's ahead when The Story returns.
Just as the eruption transformed the mountain's landscape, an easy walk from your car can transform your Mount St. Helens experience. If you want to get away from the cars and the crowds, then the Mount Margaret backcountry might be the place for you to go. It's the only place on the north side of the mountain where overnight backcountry camping is allowed. There's limited spaces. First one's about 4 miles in.
Well, you recognize that guy, Chief Meteorologist Matt Safino. You've been talking about Mount St. Helens for a few years.
A little bit. And you know what? I've been back to the Mount Margaret wilderness since then, and it's amazing. It's beautiful. So it's a great place to go backpacking and to camp. So, all right, I'm going to start you out, Blair, with an image of the eruption. And we've seen a lot of images of the eruption. The pieces you had before this were just amazing, just fascinating. But this one is interesting for several reasons. It shows obviously the eruptive plume here, but notice the edge here, and that's to the south and west, because the upper level winds were out of the southwest, pushing that plume, and boy, doesn't that look ominous, to the north and to the east. And there was heavy, heavy ashfall on Mount Adams. I believe that's where this picture was taken. And then downwind all the way up through Spokane. Now, this is a series of satellite images showing the eruption. The first one, within about an hour of the eruption, you can see the clearing that happened around the mountain. Then as you go through time, you begin to see that circle widen and get broader as it expanded and covered out through eastern Washington here, and eventually not only through eastern Washington, but to the eastern United States. This is an image put together from NOAA, the Air Resources Laboratory, and each of these lines, I know it's pretty primitive, but this is from a study way back in the 80s. And it's kind of fun to look at the old ones.
It is super cool, yeah.
Yeah. So this line, that's the ash plume at an elevation of 3 kilometers, which is a little bit less than 2 miles up. The other one here, though, this outer one, that's 16 kilometers up. That's 10 miles up. That's basically the entire, that's up into the stratosphere, basically, okay? Super high. And look at that, Blair. It goes all the way out to the East Coast.
My gosh.
Which is amazing.
That's crazy.
And you might think that, hey, this probably had an impact on world climate. Other eruptions have done that. But here's a little perspective on volcanoes and volcanic eruptions in recent history. Now, I know this is a little bit hard to read, but basically look at it this way. The bigger the orange bar here, the more stuff, it's called ejecta, that the volcano put into the atmosphere. It's in cubic miles. What's a cubic mile? Think about a box that's a mile long, a mile wide, and a mile high. A very, very large box, a very, very large volume. So the first one on the map here, 5000 BC, was right here in Oregon, Mount Mazama, now known as Crater Lake. That put about 10 cubic miles of stuff into the atmosphere. That totally impacted world climate, right? But look, Mount St. Helens shows up not once, but several times. This is back 1900 BC, not nearly as big, about a cubic mile. And then in 1480 to 1482, a little bit less than that. And as we go up the list, you see some of the other big volcanic eruptions in more modern history. Tambora in Indonesia and Krakatoa in 1883 has been well studied. That one, the sonic boom from Krakatoa was heard over 1,000 miles away in Australia, and it sent waves around the globe. They had waves in the English Channel from the eruption of Krakatoa in the Pacific. It's just amazing. So we go to our most recent eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it's pretty tiny. It was only a third of a cubic mile of ejecta, or stuff that it put into the atmosphere, or about 30 times less than what Mount Mazama did when it erupted. Now, Dr. Cliff Mass of the University of Washington and another researcher named Alan Roback did a study on the short-term weather effects of that eruption, and they found, not a surprise, that it cooled the daytime temperatures, but a little bit surprisingly, it didn't just limit the cooling at night. It actually warmed at night immediately downstream of the eruption for a day or two, because you're getting reflectivity from all those volcanic particles actually adding heat to the atmosphere. It's pretty amazing stuff.
All right, Matt, thanks so much. So interesting. We're back after this.
On the day that Mount St. Helens blew up, I was standing on the corner of 76th and St. John's Boulevard in Vancouver, Washington. And the sky filled up with these giant clouds, and all this stuff floated over us. We just stood there. We were just blown away.
We were actually out on Government Island. There was a whole group of us, and we were there when the place erupted. And I'll tell you something, it was violent enough that even on Government Island, the shaking and the fear of it and everything else literally knocked us off our feet. Very scary time.
And we'll end on this memory from one of our editors here at KGW. Dave told us, "I remember seeing on the TV the image of the huge ash plume erupting from the mountain. I was 11 years old and fascinated with it. I have a jar of ash from that eruption collected from my aunt and uncle's orchard in Wapato, Washington. It's something I'll never forget." And hey, we've actually got that jar of ash with us right here tonight. It's pretty surreal to be looking at it all these years later. Well, that's the end of our show, folks. Thanks so much for watching. Timbers 360 is coming your way next. And don't forget, everyone has a story to tell. In the meantime, have a great weekend. I'll see you right back here on Monday night at 6:30.